The galaxy was old, older than most. Species living in it could truly understand. Stars had been born, burned bright, and died long before the first. Thinking creatures had looked up at the sky and wondered what was out there, and over millions of years, many of those thinking creatures had found each other, reached out across the black emptiness, and decided that being alone was worse than being different. That was how the Concord of Gentle Minds was born. It was not an empire, it was not a government, it was more like a promise made by over 400 different species spread across thousands of star systems that they would share knowledge, protect peace, and never ever go to war with each other. The Concord had no army, it had no warships. It had libraries the size of moons and medical stations that could cure diseases across 100 different biologies, and communication networks that let a creature on one side of the galaxy talk to a creature on the other side in real time. It was by every measure that the Concord cared about a paradise. The species of the Concord were, for the most part, gentle. That was the whole point. The Laurens were tall, thin beings with skin like pale glass and eyes that shifted color with their emotions. They were artists and musicians. Their entire civilization was built around beauty. Their cities were living sculptures. Their technology was woven into crystal lattices that sang when the wind touched them. And their greatest ambition was to create something that would make another being feel wonder. The Thanari were small, six-limbed creatures covered in soft, gray fur who had devoted their entire species to mathematics and philosophy. The Olesi were aquatic beings the size of small whales who communicated through patterns of bioluminescent light and had mapped Clear's throat more of the galaxy than any other species. The Ven were ancient, slow-moving beings made of something between stone and plant matter who remembered things that had happened 1,000,000 years ago as clearly as things that happened yesterday. All of them were peaceful, all of them were kind, and none of them, not a single one, knew how to fight. They had never needed to. In the long history of the Concord, conflict had always been resolved through conversation, compromise, and patience. When two species disagreed, they talked. When resources were scarce, they shared. When a new species was discovered, they welcomed it, taught it, and brought it into the fold. Violence was something they studied in history files, a relic of primitive civilizations that had not yet learned better. The Concord believed deeply and completely that any intelligent species would eventually outgrow the need for violence. It was just a phase, a childhood illness that every civilization recovered from. That belief was about to be tested. The first reports came from the edge of Concord space, from a string of small colony worlds near the galactic rim. Communication stations went silent. Supply ships vanished. Scout vessels that were sent to investigate never came back. For weeks, the Concord treated it as a mystery, perhaps a natural disaster, perhaps a technical failure. They sent more scouts, they analyzed data, they held meetings. Then the refugees arrived. They came in broken ships packed so tightly that many had died during the journey. They were Pelori, a minor Concord species, insect-like beings with delicate wings and large dark eyes. They were shaking, they were terrified, and the story they told made no sense to the Concord. Something was coming, something from beyond the rim, from the Dark space between galaxies where no one had ever bothered to look, a swarm. Millions of ships they could even be. Called ships, they were more like living things, biological and mechanical at the same time, bristling with weapons and hunger. They did not communicate, they did not negotiate, they simply arrived consumed. Everything of value, resources, technology, sometimes the inhabitants themselves, and moved on. The Pelori called them the Vreth, mean a word in their language that roughly translated to the mouth that is never full. The Vreth dominion. The conquered reacted the way it always reacted to a problem. It formed a committee, it gathered data, it sent diplomatic envoys to the edge of its territory with messages of peace, translated into every language they knew and broadcast on every frequency. The envoys were never heard from again. The committee analyzed the silence and concluded that perhaps the Vreth simply had not understood the messages. They sent more envoys with better translations. Those envoys vanished too. Meanwhile, the Vreth kept coming. They moved like a tide, slow, steady, and unstoppable. Colony after colony fell. The conquered watched through long rain sensors as entire worlds were stripped bare. The Vreth did not occupy territory. They did not build. When they consumed and moved forward behind them, they left nothing but dead rock and empty sky. The conquered held an emergency summit. 400 species sent representatives to the great station at the center of conquered space, a massive structure called the Gathering Hall that floated in the gentle light of a binary star system. For the first time in living memory, the mood was not calm, it was afraid. Speakers took the floor one after another. The Venari presented mathematical models showing the Vreth projected path. At their current speed, the swarm would reach the heart of conquered space within 2 years. The Olsi shared sensor data showing the size of the Vreth fleet. Hundreds of thousands of vessels, maybe millions. The numbers were so large that some delegates simply refused to believe them. The Ven, ancient and patient eye, said nothing for a long time and then said something that silenced the entire hall. We have seen this before, the Ven elder said, its voice like stone grinding against stone. In the old records, in the time before the conquered, species like the Vreth come, and they consume, and they do not stop until there is nothing left to consume. We survived then because the galaxy was large and we were small, and they did not notice us, but the conquered is not small. The conquered is bright and loud and full of life. They have noticed us. The hall erupted into argument. Some species demanded that the conquered build weapons, build a fleet, find some way to fight back, but they had no weapons. They had no soldiers. They had no experience with war. Building a military from nothing would take decades, and they did not have decades. Yet other species suggested fleeing, abandoning the outer territories and retreating to the core, hoping the Vreth would lose interest. But the Pelori refugees shook their heads. The Vreth never lost interest. Other species suggested hiding, shutting down all transmissions, going dark, and hoping the swarm would pass them by. But there were too many worlds, too many people, too much infrastructure. They could not hide a civilization that spanned a quarter of the galaxy. In the end, they did what the conquered always did. They talked, they debated. They formed subcommittees to study the problem further. And while they talked, the Vreth reached Allura Prime. Allura Prime was not a strategic target. It was not a military installation or a resource hub. It was a world of artists, a world of singers and builders and dreamers. Its cities were famous. Across the conquered, towers of living crystal that grew and changed with the seasons, bridges of light that spanned rivers of liquid silver, gardens where every plant had been shaped over centuries into living works of art. Allura Prime was, to many in the conquered, the most beautiful world in the galaxy. The Vreth did not care about beauty. They arrived without warning, a wall of ships that blotted out the stars. The Alluran defense systems, such as they were, consisted of a handful of orbital platforms designed to redirect asteroids and space debris. They were not weapons. They had never been designed to fight. The Vreth swept them aside like dust. The bombardment began within hours. The Vreth did not target military installations because there were none. They targeted cities. They targeted the crystal towers and the bridges of light and the gardens that had taken centuries to grow. They burned them all. The sky above Allura Prime turned orange and black with smoke and fire, and the beautiful singing of the crystal structures became a scream as they shattered under the assault. Millions of Allurans fled underground into shelter networks that had been built long ago for natural disasters, earthquakes, storms, volcanic eruptions. The shelters were not designed for war. They were not reinforced against bombardment. They were just holes in the ground where people huddled together in the dark and listened to their world die. Above them, Elder Sarath, the leader of the Alluran people, was an old being. Her skin had faded from the bright colors of youth to a soft milky translucence. In her eyes, once a brilliant shifting kaleidoscope, had settled into a steady deep blue, the alluring color of sorrow. She had spent her entire life creating beauty. She had composed symphonies that made other species weep. She had designed gardens that bloomed in colors that most beings could not even see, and now she stood in a dark shelter beneath the ruins of her capital city, surrounded by frightened children and wounded survivors, and she knew that everything she had ever built was gone. But Sarath was not just an artist. She was a leader, and she knew that despair was a luxury her people could not afford. She made her way to the emergency communication station, a simple room with equipment that had not been used in centuries. The technicians were young, barely trained, and their hands shaking as they tried to remember procedures they had only studied in theory. Sarath stood beside them, calm and steady, and told them what to do. Send a distress signal, she said, on every frequency in every language. Send it to everyone. Elder, one of the technicians said, his voice cracking. The conquered knows what is happening. Here they have been watching. They have done nothing. Then we send it beyond the conquered. Sarath said, we send it to everyone who can hear. Someone will come. The technician looked at her with eyes full of doubt. But he did as she asked. The distress signal was simple. It was not elegant or poetic or beautiful. It was not the kind of thing the Allurans usually created. It was raw and desperate and honest. This is Allura Prime. We are under attack. Our cities are burning. Our people are dying. We have no weapons. We have no army. We cannot fight. We are asking. We are begging. Anyone who can hear this, please help us, please. We do not want to die. Signal went out at the speed of light, boosted by every relay the Alorans could reach. It crossed conquered space in hours. It was heard by hundreds of species, council chambers and government halls, and academic institutions across the galaxy received it, analyzed it, discussed it, and did nothing. The Thanari calculated that any intervention would result in unacceptable losses. The Alosi argued that the Freth might be reasoned with if given enough time. The Ven said that some things were simply beyond saving and that, Clear's throat, the conquered should focus on protecting what remained. One by one species heard the cry and turned away, not because they were cruel, not because they did not care, but because they were afraid and they did not know how to be anything else. The signal kept traveling past the borders of conquered space, past the charted systems and the known trade routes and the mapped nebulae, out into the wild, uncharted edges of the galaxy where the conquered had never bothered to look closely. It reached a small yellow star orbited by 8 planets, the third of which was a messy, noisy, chaotic little world, covered in water and dirt and an astonishing amount of electromagnetic noise. The conquered had cataloged this system centuries ago during a routine survey. The survey team had noted that the third planet was inhabited by a tool-using species, bipedal, carbon-based, moderately intelligent and extremely violent. They had tagged the file with a standard warning label: primitive, aggressive, do not contact, and then they had moved on and never thought about it again. The species on the third planet called themselves humans at 3:14 a.m. Earth Standard Time in a monitoring station buried deep in the mountains of what humans called the Swiss Alps. A junior signals analyst named Lieutenant Priya Akefer was halfway through a cup of cold coffee and a 12-hour shift that had been, until that moment, spectacularly boring. Her job was to monitor deep space frequencies for anomalies, a task that almost never produced anything interesting since humanity's deep space sensor network was still relatively young and mostly picked up natural phenomena. But at 3:14 her console lit up. It was not a natural phenomenon, it was structured, it was repeating. And after she ran it through the translation algorithms, software that humanity had been developing for decades in the hope that someone out there was talking, she realized it was a message in dozens of languages, none of which she recognized, but all of which the algorithms could parse because they followed mathematical structures that were universal. She read the translation 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time because her hands were shaking and she wanted to make sure she was not imagining things. This is Allura Prime. We are under attack. Our cities are burning. Our people are dying. We cannot fight. Please help us. Lieutenant Akefer did not form a committee. She did not run simulations. She did not debate the political implications or the strategic risks. She picked up her secure phone and called her commanding officer, Colonel James Hargrove, who was asleep in his quarters 3 floors above. Sir, she said, you need to see this right now. Colonel Hargrove was a practical man. He had spent 30 years in the United Earth Space Command, and he had learned to trust his people. He was standing in the monitoring station within 8 minutes, reading the same translation that Akefer had read. He was quiet for a long time. Is this real? He asked. The signal is real, sir. Point of origin is approximately 300 light-years from our position. The structure is too complex to be natural. Someone is asking for help. Hargrove stared at the screen. He thought about the chain of command. He thought about protocols and procedures and the 17 different approval processes that were supposed to happen before any military action could be taken. He thought about all of that, and then he thought about the words on the screen. Our people are dying. We cannot fight. Please help us. He picked up the phone and called Fleet Admiral Kaylin Reese. The call woke her. At 3:47. By 4:15, she was in her command center, surrounded by her senior staff reading the same message. By 500, she had briefed the Secretary General of the United Earth Government. By 6:00, the Security Council had convened an emergency session. There were arguments, of course there were arguments. Humanity had never made contact with an alien species before. They did not know who was sending the signal or who was attacking them or whether this was even real. The risks were enormous. Sending the fleet meant leaving Earth and the colonies vulnerable. It meant crossing 300 light-years of uncharted space. It meant fighting an enemy they knew nothing about. Some voices urged caution. Some voices urged more analysis. Some voices said this was not humanity's problem. Admiral Reese listened to all of them. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes the color of iron. She had fought in the Sol Unification Wars. She had buried friends. She knew what war cost. She also knew something that she did not need a committee to tell her. Someone out there is dying, she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the council chamber. They are calling for help. They are saying they cannot fight if we sit here and debate while they burn, and then we are not the species I thought we were. The vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. The fleet would go. By noon, the mobilization had begun. Shipyards that had been quiet for years roared to life. Soldiers on leave were recalled. Supply chains pivoted. 12 carrier groups, 47 destroyers, and over 200 support craft. Everything humanity had began converging on the staging point near Jupiter. Admiral Reese stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UES Defiance, and looked out at the fleet forming around her. These were not elegant ships. They were not beautiful. They were thick, heavy, armored machines built by a species that had been fighting itself for most of its history and had only recently decided to fight together instead. They were covered in weapons because humans had never been able to shake the feeling that the universe was dangerous and that you should always be ready. The galaxy had ignored humanity. The conquered had looked at them, seen violence and chaos and primitiveness, and had decided they were not worth knowing. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Reese opened a channel to the fleet. All ships, she said. This is Admiral Reese. You have all read the distress signal. You know what we are flying into. I will not lie to you. I do not know what we will find. I do not know if we can win. But I know this. Someone out there is scared and alone and dying, and they asked for help. That is enough for me. It should be enough for all of us. Set course for Alora Prime, best speed. With we are going to answer that call. 300 light-years away, in a dark shelter beneath a burning world, Elder Serath sat with her arms around a group of children who had stopped crying because they had run out of tears. Above them, the Vreth continued their work of destruction. The crystal towers that had taken centuries to build were falling. One by one, their songs dying in the flames. Sereth did not know if anyone had heard her signal. She did not know if anyone was coming. She only knew that she had asked, and that asking was the only thing she had left. She closed her eyes and held the children tighter. Somewhere out there the answer was already on its way. The fleet gathered near Jupiter like a storm building on the horizon. Admiral Kalen Reese watched it come together from the bridge of the UES Defiance. Even she, a woman who had spent her life around warships, felt something tighten in her chest at the sight. 12 carrier groups, 47 destroyers, 216 support craft, troop transports, medical frigates, supply haulers, tankers, repair ships. Everything humanity had built over the last century of space exploration and the decades of unification that came before it. Every ship, every fighter, every marine, all of it was converging on this one point in space, preparing to jump into the unknown. It was, she thought, either the bravest thing humanity had ever done or the most foolish. Probably both. The ships themselves told the story of what humanity was. They were not beautiful. The conquered species had they been watching would have found them crude, blocky, angular when covered in plates of heavy armor and studded with weapon emplacements like the quills of some enormous, angry animal. Their hulls were painted in dark grays and blacks, practical colors that absorb sensor pings and made them harder to spot against the void. Their names were painted on their sides in white block letters: Defiance, Relentless, Iron Will, Stubborn Hope, Last Argument. Names that said something about the species that had built them. Humans had not built these ships for exploration, though they could explore. They had not built them for science, though they carried labs and sensors. They had built them because somewhere deep in the human brain, in the part that still remembered being small and afraid on a dark savanna, there was a voice that said, "The universe is dangerous and you need to be ready." The Conquered had never understood this about humans. The Conquered survey team that had cataloged Earth centuries ago had looked at humanity's history, the wars, the weapons, the endless cycles of violence and rebuilding, and had seen a species that was broken, defective, a civilization that had not yet grown past its animal instincts. They had marked the file and moved on. What they had missed, what they could not understand from their safe distance, was that humanity's violence was not a flaw. It was a tool, a terrible, dangerous, double-edged tool that humans had spent their entire history trying to control. They had not always succeeded. They had done awful things to each other over the centuries. Things they remembered, things they studied, things they swore they would never do again. But they had also learned something from all that blood and fire, something that the gentle species of the Conquered had never needed to learn. They had learned how to fight, not just how to swing a fist or fire a weapon, but how to organize violence, how to direct it, how to use it with purpose and restraint, and when necessary, with overwhelming force. They had turned war into a science, and then they had turned that science toward the stars, and now they were about to use it for something that mattered. In the hours before the jump, The fleet buzzed with activity on the carrier UES Constellation, Captain David Chen stood on the flight deck and watched his pilots run final checks on their F-47 Firebrand strike fighters. The Firebrands were small, fast, and real mean, single-seat craft built around a pair of rapid-fire rail guns and a rack of missiles. They were not sophisticated by Concord standards. They used kinetic energy and explosive warheads instead of the elegant energy weapons that more advanced civilizations preferred, but they worked very well. Chen was 38 years old. He had grown up in a farming community in what used to be called Central China back when countries were still a thing. He had joined the Space Command because he wanted to see what was out there and because he had a gift for flying that his instructors called reckless but effective. He had never been in a real battle. None of them had. Humanity's wars had been with itself, fought on Earth and in the inner colonies. This was different. This was something entirely new. He looked at his pilots, young men and women from every corner of Earth and every human colony, checking their ships, reviewing their systems, trying to keep their hands steady. They were scared. He could see it in their eyes and the way they moved too quickly or laughed too loudly. They were scared and they were going anyway. That, Chen thought, was probably the most human thing there was. 3 decks below the flight deck, Sergeant Major Rosa Vasquez was doing her own kind of preparation. Vasquez was a Marine, 5 FT4 in of muscle and attitude packed into powered combat armor that made her 7 FT tall and capable of punching through a concrete wall. She was 41, scarred, and had been fighting in one form or another since she was 17. She had survived the Martian uprising, the Europa crisis, and a bar fight on Titan that had become legendary in Marine circles. Her job for this mission was simple on paper and impossible in practice: ground operations. If there were people down there who needed saving, it would be Vasquez and her Marines who would go down and get them. They had trained for hostage rescue, urban warfare, and civilian evacuation in 100 different scenarios. They had never trained for any of those things on an alien world against an alien enemy. She stood in the armory checking weapons with the careful attention of someone who knew that a jammed rifle meant a dead Marine. Around her, her soldiers were doing the same. Private First Class Tomoko Sato, barely 20 years old, was checking the power cells on her squad's plasma cutters with hands that trembled slightly. Corporal Kwame Asant, heavy-built like a small building, was field stripping his heavy machine gun for the 4th time, a ritual that calmed him the way prayer calmed others. Staff Sergeant Alina Petrov was sitting quietly in the corner, writing a letter. Vasquez did not ask who the letter was, for she knew that tradition. Every soldier wrote one before a mission they might not come back from. Sergeant Major, Sato said, her voice carefully controlled, do we know anything about what we are fighting? Not much, Vasquez said honestly. Signal says the attackers are some kind of swarm, lots of ships, lots of ground forces, no communication, no negotiation. They just attack and consume. So we are flying 300 light years to fight an enemy we have never seen, on a world we have never visited, to save a species we have never met, Sato said. Oh wow, that is correct. Sato was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. A small, tight, nervous smile. Sounds about right for the Marines. Vasquez allowed herself a small smile. Back. That is the spirit. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Reese was having a very different kind of conversation. She was meeting with her senior commanders via holographic conference, the captains and commodores who would lead the fleet's various battle groups. Their faces floated in air around her, blue-tinged and serious. Here is what we know, Reese said, pulling up a star chart that showed the route to Elora Prime. The path was marked in red, 300 light years of largely uncharted space. We will be making a series of warp jumps through corridors that our probes have mapped, but no human ship has ever traveled. Navigation has plotted a course using 7 intermediate jump points. Total travel time is estimated at 14 days. 14 days, said Commodore Yuki Tanaka, who commanded the fleet's destroyer Wolf Pax. She was a precise woman who spoke the way she fought in short, efficient bursts. What is the status on arrival? How much fuel and ammunition will we have? Enough, Reese said. Barely. We are loading every ship to maximum capacity. The support fleet will carry additional supplies, but I will not pretend we have a comfortable margin. If this turns into a long fight, we will be in trouble. Define long fight, said Colonel Marcus Obi, who commanded the Marine Expeditionary Force. He was a calm, steady man with a deep voice and the kind of face that made young soldiers feel safe. Yari, more than 3 weeks of sustained combat operations, Reese said. The holographic faces around her exchanged glances. 3 weeks was not much. What about the enemy? Asked Captain Sarah Kim, who commanded the carrier group centered on the UES constellation. What do we actually know about the breath? Almost nothing, Reese admitted. She pulled up the distress signal analysis. The signal from Elora Prime describes a large-scale invasion force. Thousands of ships minimum, possibly hundreds of thousands. The attackers appear to use a combination of biological and mechanical technology. They do not communicate or negotiate. They attack, consume resources, and move on. Biological and mechanical, Tanaka said, frowning, like living ships. Possibly. We will not know until we see them, and our analysts have been working with the signal data to build predictive models, but the honest truth is that we are going in mostly blind. There was a silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when smart, experienced people realize exactly how dangerous the thing they are about to do really is. Admiral, said Commodore Victor Sokolov, who commanded the fleet's heavy cruiser division. He was an older man, white-haired and calm, who had served longer than almost anyone in the fleet. I must ask the question that is on everyone's mind. Can we win this? Reese looked at him. She looked at all of them, these men and women who had trusted her with their lives and the lives of everyone under their command. I do not know, she said. I do not know the size of the enemy fleet. I do not know their weapons or their tactics or their weaknesses. I do not know if the people we are going to help will still be alive when we arrive. I do not know if we will ever come home. She paused. But I know this. Somewhere out there, people who have never hurt anyone are being destroyed by something that does not care about them. They asked for help. They begged for it. And every other civilization in the Galaxy heard that cry and did nothing. We are the only ones who answered. If we do not go, no one will. And I am not willing to live in a universe where a cry for help goes unanswered. She looked around the room. Anyone who wants to stay behind has that right. I will not force anyone on this mission. But I am going. The Defiance is going. And I believe that when the history of this moment is written, the people who came will be proud they did. No one stayed behind. The fleet jumped. On schedule, 14 days before the estimated fall of Illyria Prime. The warp corridors were rough, uncharted passages through folded space that shook the ships like toys and pushed the engines to their limits. Navigation teams worked in shifts around the clock, recalculating trajectories and adjusting course corrections in real time. Engine crews performed repairs between jumps, patching systems that were never designed for this kind of sustained stress. Conditions aboard the ships were hard. The fleet was carrying maximum loads of ammunition, fuel, and supplies, which meant that crew quarters were cramped, and common areas had been converted into storage. Meals were military rations. Functional but unpleasant, sleep was broken into short shifts, and the air recyclers worked overtime and still could not quite keep up. But the mood aboard the ships was something that would have confused the conquered species. If they could have felt it, it was not happiness, it was not excitement, it was something heavier and more complicated. A mix of fear, determination, and a strange kind of joy that humans felt when they were doing something that mattered. The ships hummed with purpose, people moved with intention. Even the most routine tasks, cleaning weapons, running diagnostics, folding laundry, were done with a focus and care that came from knowing they were heading toward something real. Stories spread through the fleet like electricity through water. The text of the distress signal was posted on every bulletin board and shared on every personal device. People read it and reread it. Our cities are burning. Our people are dying. We cannot fight. Please help us. Those words became a kind of prayer. Soldiers wrote them on their armor. Pilots painted them on their fighters. Engineers scratched them into the walls of engine rooms. It was a reminder of why they were doing this, not for glory, not for conquest, not for territory, but because someone had asked for help. On the 7th day of the journey, something happened that became legend in the fleet. A group of off-duty Marines in one of the Defiance's mess halls had been listening to the distress signal on repeat, trying to learn the sound of the Illyrian language. One of them, a young private from New Zealand named Tainwaramu, had a talent for music and languages. He had been listening to the cadence of the Illyrian words, the way they rose and fell, Asher, and he realized that the Illyrian language was musical, not just in the way that all languages have rhythm, but actually musical. The meaning of words change based on their pitch and tone, like a song clears throat. He started humming along with the signal. Then he started trying to match the words. His pronunciation was terrible. Human vocal cords were not built for the frequencies that Illyrians used, but the melody was there. Other Marines joined in, then crew members from the next table, then people from the corridor who heard the sound and came to see what was happening. Within an hour, 100 people were sitting in a mess hall on a warship heading toward an alien battle, humming the melody of a distress call. from a species they had never met. It was not a beautiful sound, it was rough and off-key and full of wrong notes, but it was honest and it was human, and somehow it was exactly right. The story spread to other ships, other groups. Tried it, the melody of the Aloran distress call became the fleet's unofficial anthem, a wordless song that everyone knew. Sound that meant we are coming, hold on. We are coming. On the 11th day, they hit a problem. 6th warp corridor on their route. Narrow passage through a region of highly unstable space had shifted since. The probes had mapped it, the corridor was still there, but it had become narrower and more turbulent. Navigation calculated that passing through it would subject the ships to gravitational stresses that exceeded their rated tolerances by 40%. In simple terms, the ships might survive the passage or they might be torn apart. Reese called a conference. The options were simple, and they could take the unstable corridor and risk losing ships. They could find an alternative route which would add at least 6 days to the journey. 6 days that Alora Prime almost certainly did not have, or they could turn back. The conference was short. We go through, Reese said, all ships. Reinforce structural integrity fields to maximum, non-essential personnel to crash positions. We go fast, we go hard. And we get through. They lost 2 ships in the passage, a supply hauler and a small escort frigate, 312 people. The fleet held a moment of silence for them as they emerged on the other side. Battered and shaken, but still moving. Reese added their names to the list she kept in her quarters, a list that she knew would be much longer before this was over. On the 14th day, the fleet reached the final jump point. Beyond it lay the Alora system. Somewhere in that system, a world was burning and people were waiting for help that they did not believe would come. Reese stood on the bridge of the Defiance. Around her the bridge crew was silent, hands on their consoles, eyes on their screens. The fleet was arrayed behind her in battle formation. Carriers in the center, destroyers on the flanks, support ships to the rear. Every weapon was loaded, every fighter was fueled. Every Marine was suited up and ready. She had given them everything she could. Training, planning, supplies. She had told them the truth about the risks. She had not promised them victory or survival. She had only promised them that what they were doing mattered. It was enough. It had always been enough. All ships, she said in her voice, calm and steady. This is Admiral Reese. On the other side of this jump, there are people who have been waiting for someone to come. They have been waiting through days of fire and death, hoping that the universe was not as cruel as it seemed. We are the answer to that hope. We are the proof that when someone cries out in the dark, they are not alone. She took a breath. I will not tell you this will be easy. I will not tell you we will all come home. But I will tell you this, what we are about to do is the most human thing we have ever done. We are going to help people who need us. Everything else is details. She looked at her helmsman. Take us in. The fleet jumped. On the other side, the stars were different. The light of the Aluran sun was a soft, warm gold, and in the system was filled with debris. Shattered orbital platforms, fragments of destroyed ships, clouds of ash and dust that had once been satellites and stations. Through the debris, the planet was visible. It was a beautiful world, blue oceans, green continents, wisps of white Cloud but huge patches of the surface were dark with smoke and fire, and in orbit around it like flies. Around a wound, the Wraith fleet swarmed. There were thousands of them. Tens of thousands, more than the worst. Estimates had predicted they were dark, irregular shapes, not built so much as grown, their hulls a blend of metal and something organic that pulsed and shifted. They bristled with weapon clusters and sensor arrays and gaping openings that might have been hangar bays or mouths. They were ugly and wrong and terrifying. The Defiance's sensors screamed with contact alerts. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as officers called out readings, distances, threat assessments. Thousands of enemy contacts, the planet surface showing massive destruction. Life signs below the surface. Survivors huddled in shelters still alive. Still alive. Reese felt something settle in her chest, not calm exactly. Something deeper. Something that humans had felt since the first time one of them had picked up a rock to defend someone who could not defend themselves. Open a channel, she said. All frequencies, all languages, everything. We have. The communications officer's hands flew across the console. Channel open. Admiral. Reese looked at the burning world. Through the viewport, she looked at the swarm that surrounded it. As she looked at the blinking lights on her tactical display that represented 10,000 enemy ships, and then she spoke. This is Admiral Kalen Reese of the United Earth Space Command. We received your distress call. We have come a long way and we are not leaving. To the people of Elora Prime, hold on, help is here. To the Vreth, this world and its people are under our protection. Leave now or we will make you leave. She paused. All ships, battle stations, launch all fighters, weapons free. Let us get to work. The fleet surged forward. The fighters poured from the carriers like wasps from a hive. The destroyers fanned out into their wolf-pack formations, weapons hot, and targeting solutions locked. 300 light-years from home, outgunned, outnumbered, and flying ships that no one in the galaxy thought could make it this far, but humanity went to war for someone else. Below them, in a dark shelter beneath a ruined city, an old Aloran woman heard a voice on a frequency she did not recognize, speaking a language she had never heard, but the translation system still worked, even underground, even now. And when the words appeared on her screen, Elder Sarath read them and felt something she had not felt in weeks. Hope, help is here. Someone had come. The Vreth had been consuming civilizations for longer than most species in the galaxy had existed. They had crossed the void between galaxies, drifting in a slow, patient migration that had taken thousands of years. And when they had arrived in this galaxy rich and full of life, they had done what they had always done. They fed. They were not stupid. The conquered species made that mistake often, even assuming that because the Vreth did not communicate in ways they understood, the Vreth must be mindless. They were not. They had intelligence, strategy, and a collective awareness that allowed millions of ships to act as one organism. They had consumed dozens of civilizations across 2 galaxies, and they had learned from every single one. They knew how species reacted when attacked. First came fear, then panic, then attempts at negotiation, then flight, then surrender. The pattern was always the same, and the Vreth had optimized their strategy around it, but when the human fleet dropped out of warp at the edge of the Allura system, broadcasting threats in, launching fighters, the Vreth encountered something they had not seen before, something that did not fit the pattern. These newcomers were not afraid, or rather, and they were afraid, and fear was a chemical response that the Vreth could detect in biological organisms, and the humans radiated it. But they were not acting on their fear. They were acting on something else, something the Vreth did not have a category for. The humans were afraid, and they were attacking anyway. They were outnumbered by a factor of nearly 50 to 1, and they were attacking anyway. Their ships were small and crude compared to the biomechanical vessels of the Dominion, and they were attacking anyway. It did not make sense. The Vreth allocated additional processing power to problem and continued with their standard response: overwhelm, consume, move on. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Admiral Reese had spent the 14-day journey to Allura Prime studying every scrap of data humanity had about the Wraith, which was very little, and filling the gaps with educated guesses based on what she did know, which was how to fight. She had been a student of military history since she was a girl. She had studied every great battle and every great commander in human history, from Thermopylae to Stalingrad, from Midway to the Battle of Mars. She knew that being outnumbered was not the same as being outmatched. She knew that technology alone did not win wars. She knew that will, creativity, and the willingness to take risks could overcome almost any disadvantage. Her plan was built on 3 pillars. The first pillar was the carriers. The 12 carrier groups would position themselves in a defensive ring around the largest population centers on Allura Prime surface, using the planet's gravity well as a natural barrier on one side, where their fighter wings would provide a layered defense, close-range interceptors to stop the Wraith from reaching the surface, and long-range strike fighters to hit the larger Wraith ships at a distance. The carriers themselves were heavily armored and bristling with point defense weapons, rapid-fire railgun turrets that could fill the space around a ship with a wall of metal slugs. They were not fast, but they were hard to kill. The second pillar was the destroyers. Commodore Tanaka's wolf packs, groups of 3 to 5 destroyers operating together, would be the fleet's offensive arm. They would not try to hold territory or defend positions. Their job was to hunt. They would sweep through the Wraith formation in fast, coordinated strikes to targeting the largest enemy ships, the ones that seemed to serve as command nodes or resource processors, and hit them with everything they had before pulling back and disappearing into the chaos of battle. Hit and run over and over. The third pillar was the Marines. Colonel Obi's ground forces would deploy to the surface as soon as it was safe enough to land, which Reese suspected would be never. Their mission was to reach the Alluran shelters, establish secure perimeters, and begin evacuating civilians to safe zones where transport ships could pick them up. It was the most dangerous part of the plan because it meant sending soldiers into a war zone on foot, surrounded by an enemy that controlled the sky and the ground. Reese had told her commanders that the plan was flexible. She had told them to use their judgment to adapt and her men to improvise. She had told them the truth that no plan survived first contact with the enemy, and that the real plan was to be smarter, tougher, and more stubborn than whatever was waiting for them. The battle began the moment the fleet arrived. The first wave of Wraith ships came at them like a wall of teeth, thousands of small fast attack craft, each one about the size of a human fighter, but faster and more agile, with biological weapons that fired streams of superheated plasma. They swarmed toward the human fleet in a pattern that looked random, but was not. They were testing, probing, looking for weak points. The human fighters met them head-on. Captain David Chen was the first pilot to score a kill. His firebrand dove into the leading edge of the swarm, and his rail guns tore through an attack craft in a burst of metal and organic debris. The Wraith craft did not have traditional shields. Their organic hulls absorbed some kinetic energy, but not enough to stop a railgun round traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Chen fired again. Another kill, another. The Wraith craft were fast but human. Targeting computers were faster, and railgun rounds did not care about armor or biology. They punched through everything. All fighters engage at will. Chen broadcast to his wing, they are fast, but they are not tough. Hit them and keep moving, do not stop. The space around Alara Prime erupted into a maelstrom of fire and debris. Human fighters and Wraith attack craft wove through each other in a brutal dance, exchanging fire at ranges that would have given conquered naval theorists heart attacks. Human pilots died there. Fighters shattered by plasma fire. Their escape pods sometimes recovered, sometimes not, but for every human fighter that fell, a dozen Wraith craft were destroyed. The humans were better trained, better coordinated, and their weapons were devastatingly effective. But there were so many Wraith, so impossibly many. The swarm adapted. The Wraith collective intelligence analyzed the human tactics in real time and began adjusting. Attack craft started coming in larger groups, overwhelming individual fighters with sheer numbers. They shifted their approach angles, coming from above and below the ecliptic plane where the human defensive formations were thinner. They targeted the carriers while sending waves of kamikazes that crashed into the armored hulls, each one a small explosion that chipped away at the thick plating. Reese watched the tactical display from the bridge of the Defiance, her eyes tracking the flow of the battle with the practiced calm of a commander who knew that panic was the enemy of good decisions. The carriers were holding the point, defense networks were shredding the kamikaze waves, but the Wraith were learning, and they were not running out of ships. Tanaka, she said, begin your attack runs. Target their biggest ships, the ones at the back of the formation. I want them to know we can reach them anywhere. Commodore Tanaka smiled. It was not a friendly smile. With pleasure, Admiral. The destroyer wolf pack surged forward. If the carrier battle was a siege, the destroyer attacks were surgery. Fast, too precise and brutal. Tanaka's ships moved in tight formations, their engines running hot, cutting through the gaps in the Wraith swarm like knives through flesh. They targeted the massive hive ships that loomed at the center of the Wraith formation, organic mountains of metal and tissue, each 1 kilometer long, each one a processing node for the collective intelligence. The destroyers hit them with nuclear-tipped kinetic impactors, warheads mounted on dense metal rods that were accelerated to incredible speeds, and then detonated on impact. Each hit was a miniature sun, a flash of white fire that tore through organic hull material like paper. The hive ship screamed, not on any frequency that sensors could detect, but the Vreth swarm around them reacted with something that looked like pain. Ships veering off course there, formations breaking apart, the collective coordination faltering for precious seconds. Tanaka pushed the advantage. Her wolf packs hit another hive ship, then another. She rotated her formations, pulling damaged destroyers back and sending fresh ones forward. Her ships were taking hits. The Vreth plasma weapons were scoring burns on their armor, melting sensors, destroying weapon mounts. But the destroyers kept coming. They were built to take punishment. They were built by humans. The battle raged for 3 days, 3 days of continuous combat, 3 days with no sleep for anyone, with damage control teams running from breach to breach, with pilots flying sortie after sortie until their hands cramped on the controls and their vision blurred. 3 days of watching friends die on tactical displays, green dots winking out, only not replaced by the cold blue marker that meant a ship was gone. 3 days of holding the line. On the second day, the Marines went in. Colonel Obi had watched the space battle from the troop transports and had decided Clear's throat that waiting for it to be safe was not an option. The Allurans were dying underground. Their shelters were not designed for extended sieges. Air was running out, water recyclers were failing, and the breath had begun sending ground forces to the surface to root out survivors. If the Marines did not go now, there would be no one left to save. The landing was violent. The transport ships dropped through the atmosphere, under fire, their hulls glowing orange with breath anti-air organisms, things that looked like flying jellyfish with plasma stingers, tried to burn them out of the sky. Point defense gunners on the transports fired continuously, filling the air with tracer rounds, and the fighters above provided what cover they could, but 5 transports were lost on the way down. 500 Marines gone before they even reached the ground. Sergeant Major Vasquez felt her transport hit the ground hard enough to rattle her teeth. Inside her helmet, the ramp dropped. Daylight, wrong daylight, tinged orange and gray with smoke, flooded in. She could see a cityscape ahead, or what was left of one, the alluring crystal towers were shattered stumps, their beautiful singing replaced by the groan of breaking structures and the distant thunder of breath bombardment. Fires burned everywhere. The air was thick with ash. Marines, move out, she shouted. First objective, shelter entrance at grid. Reference 47, East civilian evacuation. Priority, stay together, watch your sectors and do not stop moving. They moved through the ruins like ghosts in metal skin. The powered exoskeletons gave them strength and speed that would have been impossible otherwise. They could leap over rubble, punch through walls, carry the wounded at a full run. Their weapons were loud and crude by galactic standards, automatic rifles that fired high-velocity tungsten rounds, grenade launchers, shoulder-mounted missile systems, but they were effective. Vreth ground forces were different from the space forces. They were larger bipedal organisms, armored and thick chitin-carrying biological weapons that fired acid or plasma. They were tough, but they were not tougher than a Marine in powered armor with a clear line of fire. When the first contact was at a Collapsed intersection 3 blocks from the shelter entrance, a group of Vreth warriors, 20, maybe 30, were trying to dig into the shelter from above, clawing at the ground with limbs that could tear through metal. Vasquez's squad hit them from the flank, rifles blazing, grenades arcing through the smoke. The Vreth turned to face the new threat, and for a moment Vasquez saw something in their posture. Not just aggression, but confusion. They were not used to being attacked from behind. They were not used to being attacked at all. The fight was short and brutal. The Marines put down every Vreth warrior in the intersection in under 4 minutes. Corporal Asant Manning, the squad's heavy machine gun, fired with a steady mechanical rhythm that turned the Vreth's chitin armor into fragments, and the Private Soto threw demolition charge into a Vreth cluster with hands that no longer shook. Staff Sergeant Petrov directed fire with crisp, calm commands, her letter to her daughter safely sealed in her armor storage pocket. They reached the shelter entrance. It was sealed, a heavy door designed for earthquakes, not warfare. Vasquez banged on it with an armored fist, a sound that echoed through the tunnel below like thunder. "This is the United Earth Space Command," she called through her suits. "External speakers, we are here to help. We are going to open this door and get you out. Do not be afraid." There was silence. Then slowly the door opened. The Lorens inside looked nothing like anything the Marines had ever seen. They were tall, thin, with skin like frosted glass and wide eyes that shifted color as they stared at the armored giants standing in their doorway. There were hundreds of them. Women, children, elderly, wounded. They were packed into a space meant for a fraction of their number. The air was bad. Many were unconscious. Some were dead. A young Aloran near the front of the group stared at Vasquez. His eyes shifted from gray on the color of despair to bright burning gold that Vasquez did not understand but would later learn was the Aloran color of hope. He said something in his own language, the translation software in Vasquez's helmet took a moment to process it. "You came," he said. "You actually came." "We did," Vasquez said. "Now let us get you out of here." The evacuation of Alora Prime's shelters took 8 days, 8 days of fighting through ruined cities, establishing secure corridors, carrying the wounded and the children and the elderly through war zones to transport ships that flew them to safety. 8 days of Marines holding intersections and doorways and bridges against Vreth counterattacks that came in waves, each wave bigger and more desperate than the last. The snorts, stories that came out of those 8 days would be told for centuries. Squad of Marines held a hospital entrance for 14 hours straight against continuous Vreth assault. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the squad leader, Lieutenant James Park, standing in a doorway choked with Vreth dead, his armor or his ammunition gone, his rifle being used as a club. Behind him, 300 Alaran patients were still alive, all of them. He had not let a single breath through. Private Tain Wermu, the same young Marine who had learned to hum the Alaran distress signal, was part of a team that found a shelter full of children. The children were terrified of the armored humans, screaming and hiding. Wermu took off his helmet, knelt down, and started humming the melody he had learned on the ship. The Alaran children fell silent. They stared at this strange, soft creature who was making sounds that almost not quite sounded like their language. One by one they crept forward. One of them touched his face. Weremu smiled and kept humming. They followed him out of the shelter, a line of tiny glass-skinned children, following a humming marine through a burning city. Sergeant Major Vasquez carried a wounded Alaran elder through 2 km of contested streets, though the elder was heavy, limp, barely conscious, and the streets were crawling with wrath. Vasquez moved from cover to cover, firing one-handed with her sidearm, her other arm cradling the Alaran like a child. She took 3 plasma hits, one that melted the armor on her left shoulder, one that scorched her back, one that nearly took off her leg. She kept moving. She delivered the elder to a medical transport, laid her gently on a stretcher, and then went back for more. In space, the battle continued to rage. The Wrath, frustrated by their inability to break the human defensive formation, made their biggest gamble. They concentrated their entire remaining fleet, thousands of ships, into a single massive assault aimed directly at the Defiance. If they could destroy the flagship, they believed the human fleet would fragment. Weren't they were wrong about humans? Admiral Reese saw the assault coming on. Her tactical display, a tidal wave of ships converging on her position. She had 2 choices. She could pull back, reposition, try to avoid the blow, or she could stand her ground and take it. She chose to stand. All ships, she broadcast, her voice steady as stone, they are coming for us. Good, that means they are not hitting the planet. Every second they spend on us is a second the Marines have to evacuate civilians. We hold this position. We hold it until the job is done. The Defiance shuddered as the first wave hit. Explosions bloomed across the viewport. The ship rocked and groaned, its armor absorbing impacts that would have destroyed any conquered vessel. Reese gripped the arms of her command chair and watched her tactical display with the cold focus of a woman who had made her peace with death a long time ago. The fleet closed ranks around the Defiance. Destroyers that had been hunting hive ships raced back to defensive positions. Fighters formed a screen so thick that the breath had to fight through layers of fire to reach the capital ships. The carrier groups poured everything they had into the defensive perimeter. Rail guns, missiles, point defense cannons, filling space with so much metal that the breath assault slowed, stalled, and began to break apart. But the cost was terrible. Ships were dying. The destroyer UES Ironwell took a direct hit from a hive ship's main weapon and broke in half, both sections continuing to fire until they went dark. The carrier UES Constellation, Captain Chen's ship, lost its flight. Decked to a kamikaze strike, Chen himself was pulled from his ruined fighter by rescue shuttle, unconscious, both legs broken, alive only because his suit's emergency systems had sealed his injuries before he bled out. The battle raged for 11 days in total. 11 days of fire and blood and metal and courage. 11 days of humans dying for people they had never met. And on the 11th day the Vreth broke. It did not happen all at once. It started with the outer elements of the swarm pulling back, attack craft disengaging, hive ships turning away. Then the middle formations began to drift, their coordination failing as the collective intelligence struggled to process something it had never experienced before. a prey species that would not stop. Fighting, the Vreth had lost thousands of ships. They had failed to take the planet. They had failed to destroy the human fleet. And the humans were still coming. Retreat became a route. The Vreth swarm pulled away from Alura Prime, gathering itself into a loose mass that drifted toward the edge of the system. For the first time in anyone's memory, for the first time in the Vreth's own ancient memory, the Dominion fled from a fight. On the bridge of the battered, broken, still floating Defiance, Admiral Reese watched the Vreth retreat. On her tactical display, around her the bridge crew sat in stunned silence. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were just sitting, staring at their screens, unable to believe what they were seeing. Reese was quiet for a long time. Then she opened the channel. All ships, this is Admiral Reese. The enemy is withdrawing. Maintain defensive positions. Continue evacuation operations. Do not pursue. She paused. Well done. Well done, all of you. She closed the channel and sat back in her chair. The Defiance's bridge was scorched and battered. Half the consoles were dark, and there was a crack in the viewport that maintenance would later describe as concerning. Through that cracked viewport, the gold light of the Aluran sun shone on a world that was scarred and burning, but alive. They had done it. The numbers came in over the following days, and they were heavy. Humanity had lost a third of its fleet. 42,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines were dead. Dozens of ships were destroyed, and most of the rest were damaged. The fleet that had crossed 300 light years was barely capable of limping home, but a lower prime still stood. With it, its people were battered, traumatized, and homeless, but they were alive. Every single shelter had been reached. Every single survivor who could be saved had been saved. The Marines had not left anyone behind. On the surface of the planet, in a clearing that had once been a garden, Sergeant Major Vasquez stood next to Private Wiremu and looked up at the sky. The smoke was clearing. Through the gaps they could see stars. Sergeant Major, Wiremu said quietly, "Do you think it was worth it?" Vasquez thought about the 42,000 names that would be added to humanity's roll of honor dead. She thought about the ships that would never fly again, and the families that would never be whole again. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the Aloran child she had seen an hour ago, so sleeping peacefully in a medical tent for the first time in weeks, safe because a species from 300 light years away had decided that her life mattered. Yeah, Vasquez said, it was worth it. Above them, the battered remnants of the human fleet hung in orbit, keeping watch over a world that was not theirs, but that they had bled for, and across the galaxy on conquered observation ships, and in council chambers, and in the homes of 100 different species. Beings who had done nothing watched the aftermath and felt something they had not felt before, shame, and behind the shame growing slowly like a seed in dark soil, something else, admiration. The footage arrived first, before the diplomats came, before the council. Debates began before any official statement was made by anyone in the conquered of gentle minds, and the footage arrived. It came from conquered observation ships that had been stationed at the edge of the Alura system, small unarmed vessels with powerful sensors whose entire purpose was to watch and record. They had been watching when the Breathers attacked, they had been watching when the Alloran screamed. For help, they had been watching when the Conquered did nothing, and they had been watching when the humans came. The footage spread through Conquered communication networks like fire through dry grass. It was raw, unedited, and devastating. It showed the human fleet arriving. Those ugly heavy ships dropping out of warp in a flash of distorted light. Immediately broadcasting their presence. Immediately launching fighters. Oh, it showed the battle in brutal detail. Human ships taking hits that should have destroyed them and continuing to fight. Human pilots flying into gaps in the breather formation that no sane navigator would attempt. Human destroyers charging at hive ships 100 times their size. It showed the landing transport ships screaming through an atmosphere full of fire. Marines hitting the ground running, moving through burning cities toward the shelters, and then there were the ground recordings. The observation ships had deployed micro drones to the surface. Tiny camera platforms the size of insects, and those drones had captured everything. They captured Marines kicking down doors and carrying Allura into safety. They captured a human soldier standing alone in a doorway firing until his weapon was empty and then fighting with his fists. They captured Private Waramu humming to a group of terrified children, leading them through smoke and rubble with nothing but a melody and a gentle voice. They captured Sergeant Major Vasquez, armor melted and burning, carrying in Allura and Elder through a war zone, because putting her down was not something Vasquez was capable of doing. The footage was not propaganda. No one had staged it or edited it or added commentary. It was just what had happened, recorded by machines that did not understand what they were seeing. But the people who watched it understood. The Conquered had never seen anything like it on the Thanari homeworld, a planet of libraries and lecture halls. The footage played on every screen in every university. The Thanari were mathematical beings. They understood the world through numbers, equations, and logical proofs. And they looked at the footage and tried to make sense of it in their usual way. They calculated the odds of the human fleet surviving the battle. They analyzed the tactical decisions and found them to be, by conventional military theory, somewhere between reckless and insane. They computed the cost-benefit ratio of the entire operation, the resources spent, the lives lost, the strategic value gained, and found that by any rational measure, the humans should not have come. And yet they had come, and they had won. And the Thanari, for the first time in their recorded history, encountered a problem that their mathematics could not solve. They called it the human variable, a factor in the equation that they could not define, could not quantify, and could not predict. It was the difference between what a rational species should do and what humans actually did. It was the gap between logic and something else, something the Thanari did not have a word for. Their philosophers would spend decades trying to name it. The closest they ever came was a Thanari concept that translated roughly as the madness that saves. On the Olsi homeworld, deep beneath a world-spanning ocean, the footage was displayed in shimmering bioluminescent patterns across the walls of their great debate chambers. The Olesi were scientists and map makers. They had charted more of the galaxy than anyone. They prided themselves on their objectivity, their ability to observe and record without bias or emotion. They had been the ones who first cataloged the Sol system and its primitive, aggressive inhabitants, and now they watched that primitive species save a world, and the Olesi felt something that their emotional vocabulary was barely equipped to describe. It was not admiration exactly, it was not guilt exactly. It was more like the feeling of having been completely, fundamentally wrong about something and only realizing it when it was almost too late. Their grand cartographer, the highest authority in Olesi society, issued a formal statement that would become one of the most quoted texts in galactic history. "We mapped the galaxy," the grand cartographer said, her words pulsing in patterns of blue and gold light. "We charted every star, every world, every civilization. We believed we understood the shape of things, but we missed something. We looked at the humans and saw only what was on the surface. The violence, the chaos, the noise, and we did not look deeper. We did not see what lay beneath. That was our failure. We are cartographers, and we failed to map the thing that mattered most. On the Ven homeworld, a slow, quiet planet where the ancient stone plan beings lived in patient contemplation. The reaction was different. The Ven did not watch the footage with shock or surprise. They watched it with recognition. The Ven elder who had spoken at the emergency summit, the one who had warned the conquered about the Vreth, watched the footage of the battle in silence. When it was over, the elder spoke a single sentence that was transmitted to every Ven community across the conquered. "We have been waiting for them," the elder said. "For 1,000,000 years we have been waiting for a species that would do this shrine, and we told them to stay away." But it was on Alora Prime itself that the aftermath hit hardest. The Alorans were a people of beauty and art. Their entire culture, their entire sense of self was built around creation, the making of things that inspired wonder and joy. And now their world was in ruins. Their crystal cities were shattered. Their gardens were ash. Their songs were silent. Everything they had built over centuries was gone. They should have been destroyed by this. Culturally, spiritually, emotionally, by every measure the conquered used to assess the health of a civilization. The Alorans should have been broken. They had lost everything that defined them, but they had not lost everything. They had their lives, Mayan. They had them because strangers from the other side of the galaxy had decided those lives were worth fighting for. Elder Sareth walked through the ruins of her capital city in the days after the battle. She was accompanied by 2 human Marines who had been assigned as her escort. Not Clear's throat because she had asked for one, but because Sergeant Major Vasquez had decided that the Aloran leader needed protection and had sent her 2 best soldiers without being asked. The Marines walked behind Sareth in their battered armor, weapons ready, eyes scanning the rubble. They did not speak. They did not need to. Sareth looked at the destruction around her and felt grief so deep it was like drowning. Every broken crystal spire, every shattered bridge, every burned garden was a piece of her people's soul. Wherever she could hear the ghosts of the songs that the crystals used to sing, melodies that had played across her city for generations, now silenced forever. She stopped at a place where a great tower had once stood. It had been the tallest structure on Alora Prime, a spire of living crystal that had grown. For 600 years, its surface constantly shifting through colors that no other species could see. It had been called the voice of Allura, because when the wind blew through it, it sang a song that was said to contain the entire history of the Allura people. Sareth's grandmother had tended it, her mother had tended it, Sareth herself had spent decades nurturing its growth, adjusting its harmonics, teaching it new songs. Now it was a stump of blackened crystal, barely taller than a human. Sareth stood before it for a long time, and the two Marines stood behind her, silent and still. Then she reached out and touched the broken crystal. It was warm, not from fire. The fires had been out for days, warm. From within, alive. Sareth closed her eyes. The crystal pulsed beneath her fingers. It was damaged, broken, barely functioning. But it was alive, and deep within it, like a seed buried in scorched earth, there was still a song, faint, fragile. But there, she opened her eyes and turned to the Marines behind her. They were young, one a woman with dark skin and patient eyes, the other a man with red hair and a face full of freckles. They were watching her with an expression she had learned to recognize in human faces over the past weeks. It was concern, genuine concern for her people, from beings who had no reason to feel it except that they simply did. It is still alive, Sareth said. The woman Marine nodded. Then it can grow back. Sareth looked at her. Then she looked at the ruined city around her, the broken towers, the ash-covered streets, the smoke-stained sky. She thought about her people, huddled in shelters and medical camps, grieving and lost. She thought about the humans who had crossed the stars to save them, who were even now helping to dig survivors from collapsed buildings and distribute food and medical supplies, and generally doing 1,000 things that no one had asked them to do. Yes, Sarah said, it can grow back, but it will grow differently. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened on Allura Prime. The Allurans began to build again, not to rebuild. The old city was gone, and trying to recreate it would have been an exercise in grief. Oddly, instead, they built something new. They worked alongside the human engineers and Marines who stayed behind to help, and the things they created were different from anything Allura had produced before. The new structures were still beautiful. The Allurans could not build anything that was not beautiful, but they were also strong. Where the old crystal towers had been delicate and fragile, the new ones were reinforced with human engineering principles, internal supports, redundant structures, materials that could withstand bombardment. They were beautiful and hard, graceful and tough. They were what happened when a species of artists met a species of fighters, and each saw in the other something they had been missing. The human soldiers helped. They helped with their hands and their machines and their strange, loud, over-energetic way of doing everything at twice the speed the Allurans thought possible. They cleared rubble, they repaired infrastructure, they set up water purification systems and emergency power stations and communication networks. They did it with a cheerful, tireless enthusiasm that baffled the Allurans, who were used to doing things slowly and carefully and with great deliberation. And in the process, something happened that no one had planned. The two species began to understand each other. The Allurans learned that humans were not the mindless brutes the Conquered had described. They were loud and rough, and sometimes crude, but they were also kind, astonishingly, consistently kind, in ways that seemed to cost them nothing. A Marine would spend his free time teaching Aloran children a human game called catch. A pilot would sit with an elderly Aloran for hours listening to stories she could not understand just because the elder seemed lonely. An engineer would notice that a temporary shelter was positioned where it would block the view of a surviving garden and would spend an extra day repositioning it so that the Alorans inside could see the flowers. The humans learned that the Alorans were not the helpless creatures they had appeared to be. They were stronger than they looked, not physically but in their resilience, their ability to find beauty, even devastation, their refusal to let grief destroy their capacity for wonder. Gooden, an Aloran artist, began creating portraits of the human soldiers, crystal sculptures that captured not just their appearance but something deeper, something about the way they moved and laughed and fought. The soldiers were stunned when they saw themselves reflected in crystal, rendered with a beauty and honesty that no human artist had ever achieved. Meanwhile, the Conquered was in chaos. The emergency summit reconvened, and this time the mood was not afraid. It was angry at the Vreth, yes, but also angry at itself. Species that had been content to watch while the Alora burned were now confronted with the footage of what had happened while they did nothing, and the shame was immense. Delegations arrived at Alora Prime, dozens of them from species across the Conquered. They came with aid and supplies and medical equipment and offers of help. They came because they genuinely wanted to help, but also because the contrast between their inaction and humanity's sacrifice had become unbearable. Every Conquered citizen who saw the footage of a human Marine carrying an Aloran child through fire was forced to ask themselves a question that the Conquered's philosophy of non-intervention had never prepared them for. If someone is suffering and you can help, is choosing not to help really peace? The Conquered also sent diplomatic envoys to the human fleet. This was complicated because officially humans did not exist. As far as the Conquered was concerned, they had been tagged as primitives and ignored. There were no diplomatic protocols for the situation because no one had imagined it. Well, the first envoy was a Thanari diplomat named Kethbar, a small six-limbed being with enormous eyes and a reputation for brilliant negotiation. Kethbar had been chosen because the Thanari were considered the most rational species in the Conquered, and rationality seemed like the safest approach to dealing with an unknown species that had just demonstrated terrifying capacity for violence. Kethbar boarded the Defiance with a team of translators and analysts expecting to meet a barbarian warlord on a ship of war. What he found instead was a tired woman in a rumpled uniform sitting in a chair on a bridge that smelled like coffee and burned wiring, reading casualty reports with a focused sadness of someone who was determined to honor every name. Admiral Reese, Kethbar said through his translation device, I am Kethbar, here representing the Conquered of gentle minds. I am here to we wish to. He stopped. The prepared speech suddenly felt ridiculous. We are ashamed, he said instead. We heard the call for help. We did nothing. You came. We do not understand why, but we are ashamed that we did not. Reese looked at him for a long moment, She was exhausted. She had not slept more than 3 hours in any stretch for weeks. She had 42,000 names on her list. She was holding a data pad that contained the latest casualty figures and repair estimates and supply inventories, and every number was a reminder of what this mission had cost. I appreciate that, she said, but shame does not help anyone. What would help? Ketvar asked. Korna, do you have technology that can repair our ships? Yes. Do you have medical capabilities beyond ours? Almost certainly. Can you help the Alorans rebuild? Of course. Then do those things, Reese said, and while you are doing them, think about what happens the next time someone calls for help. Ketvar was quiet, then he asked the question that was really on his mind. The question that the entire Concord wanted answered. Why did you come? He asked. You did not know the Alorans. You had never heard of them. You had no agreement with them, no treaty, no obligation. You Snorts risked everything, your fleet, your soldiers, your future for strangers. We have analyzed this from every angle, and we cannot find a rational explanation. Why did you come? Reese set down her data pad as she looked at the Thanari diplomat with eyes that were red-rimmed with exhaustion and something else, something that Ketvar's translators struggled to categorize. Because they asked, she said. Ketvar waited for more. There was no more. That is the entire reason, he asked. That is the entire reason, Reese said. Someone was in trouble. They asked for help. We could help, so we did. I understand that might be hard for you to process. I understand your people think in terms of cost and benefit and rational self-interest, but that is not how humans work. We help because someone needs help. That is the beginning and the end of it. She leaned forward. Your Concord has existed for thousands of years. You have built something remarkable. Community of hundreds of species living in peace. I respect that. But somewhere along the way, when you forgot something, peace is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is the willingness to protect it, and protecting it means standing up when someone cannot stand up for themselves. Even when it is dangerous, even when it costs you something. That is what peace actually requires. Kethwar did not respond immediately. He was thinking, really thinking in the deep, slow, thorough way that Thanari thought about things that challenged their understanding of the universe. You are offering us an alliance, he said finally. I am offering you a friendship, Reese said. Alliances have terms and conditions. Friendships just have trust. We did not come here to build an empire or to claim territory or to make the conquered owe us. We came because it was the right thing to do. If you want to be our friends, then be our friends. Help us repair our ships, help the Alorans rebuild, and the next time someone cries out in the dark, stand up with us. The Concord's response came slowly, as was its nature. But it came. Technology began to flow to the human fleet. Advanced materials, better power systems, star charts that expanded humanity's knowledge of the galaxy by a factor of 1,000. Medical teams arrived to treat the human wounded with techniques that could heal injuries in hours that would have taken human doctors months. Engineers helped repair the battered ships with methods that made them stronger than they had been before. But the most important change was not technological, it was cultural. Across the conquered, the old philosophy of non-intervention was being questioned. Young Alorans were asking their elders to teach them how to defend their world. With Thenari, scholars were studying human military history with the intensity they usually reserved for pure mathematics. Olesi navigators were charting potential defensive positions and supply routes, activities that would have been considered obscene a year ago. Even the ancient Ven, who had not moved quickly in a million years, were discussing something they called the human lesson. On Alora Prime, the first memorial was raised. The Alorans built it where the voice of Alora had once stood. A new structure grown from the living crystal that still pulsed in the ruins of the old tower. It was not a replacement for what had been lost. It was something new. A tower of crystal that incorporated human design elements, strong and beautiful at the same time. Inside it, 42,000 crystal nodes had been grown, and we won for each human who had died in the battle. When the wind blew through the tower, each node sang with a slightly different voice, and together they created a song that was unlike anything the Alorans or the humans had ever heard. The Alorans called it the Song of the Answered Call. Sarath stood at its base on the day it was completed, surrounded by Aloran artists and human marines and conquered diplomats, and she listened to the crystals sing the names of the dead. It was, she thought, the most beautiful thing her people had ever created, not because of the craftsmanship or the technology or the design, but because of what it meant. It meant that the universe was not as cold as it sometimes seemed. It meant that when you cried out in the dark, sometimes someone heard you, sometimes someone came. And it meant that Alora Prime would never be helpless again. Because in the days after the memorial was raised, Elder Sarath walked to the human command post and found Admiral Reese and asked her a question that no conquered species had ever asked before. Will you teach us to fight? Reese looked at the old Aloran artist, this gentle being who had spent her life creating beauty, who had watched her world burn, and who was now asking to learn the art of war. It was, Reese thought, the saddest and bravest thing she had ever heard. Yes, Reese said, we will teach you. And somewhere in the dark spaces between the stars, the Vreth Dominion was regrouping, licking its wounds, processing the impossible thing that had happened to it. Learning. It would be back. It was always back. But the next time it came, when it would not find a galaxy of gentle minds waiting in the dark, hoping to be left alone, it would find something else entirely. 2 years passed. In galactic terms, 2 years was nothing, a blink, a heartbeat, a single grain of sand falling through an hourglass the size of a star. But for the species of the conquered of gentle minds, those 2 years changed everything. It started small. A group of young Elorans traveled to Earth, the first aliens to ever set foot on the human homeworld, to study at the United Earth Military Academy in Geneva. They were artists, musicians, architects. They had never held a weapon. They had never raised their voices in anger. They arrived expecting to find a world of warriors, hard and cold and efficient, a planet that had been shaped by violence into something blunt and sharp. What they found was something else entirely. Earth was messy, it was loud and crowded and chaotic, full of contradictions that made no sense. The same species that had built weapons capable of cracking a planet, had also built concert halls where a single voice could bring 1,000 people to tears. The same cities that housed military command centers also housed museums, parks, schools, bakeries, theaters, and an astonishing number of places where humans gathered for no purpose other than to sit together and drink hot brown liquid they called coffee. Humans could be terrifying in battle and absurdly gentle in peace. They could argue with each other over trivial things with an intensity that suggested the fate of the universe hung in the balance, and then laugh about it 5 minutes later. The Aloran students were bewildered at first and then fascinated, then something deeper. They trained alongside human cadets, learning tactics and strategy and weapons handling. The physical training was brutal by Aloran standards. Alorans were not built for endurance or strength in the way humans were. But the human instructors adapted. They did not make the training easier. Instead, they found ways to help the Alorans use their own strengths, their extraordinary spatial awareness, their ability to process multiple sensory inputs simultaneously, their precision and attention to detail. An Aloran might not be able to carry a heavy weapon for 10 km across rough terrain, but an Aloran could see a battlefield in 3 dimensions with a clarity that left human tacticians speechless. Within months, either first Aloran training cadre was sent home to begin building Alora's first defense force. They carried with them human tactical manuals translated into the Aloran musical language, training equipment modified for Aloran physiology, and something less tangible but more important, a new understanding of what it meant to protect something you loved. The Alorans were just the beginning. Word of what humanity had done at Alora Prime had spread to every corner of the conquered, and with it came a question that the conquered had never had to face. What happens when the things you love are threatened and you cannot defend them? For species that had spent centuries or millennia believing that violence was a primitive impulse to be outgrown, the question was deeply uncomfortable. But the footage from Alora Prime made it unavoidable. The Vreth had not cared about the conquered's philosophy of peace. They had not been impressed by its culture or its knowledge or its kindness. They had come to consume, and the only thing that had stopped them was a species willing to fight. One by one, conquered species began reaching out to humanity. Not all of them. Some still believed that arming themselves was a step backward, betrayal of everything the conquered stood for. The debates in the gathering hall were fierce and sometimes bitter, but the numbers shifted steadily, pushed by the simple, undeniable reality that the Vreth were still out there. The Thanari were among the first to change. They did not have the physical ability to be soldiers. They were small, fragile beings who would break in conditions that humans considered mild exercise. But they were the finest mathematicians in the galaxy, and when they turned that mathematical genius toward military problems, the results were extraordinary. Thanari analysts developed predictive models for Vreth behavior that were orders of magnitude more accurate than anything human intelligence had produced. They designed early warning sensor networks that could detect a Vreth incursion from halfway across the galaxy. They optimized fleet formations and supply logistics with an elegance that human commanders found almost beautiful. The Olsi contributed their unmatched knowledge of galactic geography. They had mapped every star system, every trade route, every navigational hazard in the known galaxy. Now they used that knowledge to identify choke points, defensive positions, and strategic corridors where a defending fleet could turn the Vreth's numbers against them. They redesigned their famous star charts with a new layer military overlays that showed fields of fire, retreat routes, and rally points. An Olsi admiral, the first in their species history, was appointed to help coordinate the growing coalition fleet. Even the Ven contributed in their slow, ancient way. They opened their archives, records that stretch back millions of years, and shared everything they knew about the breath. It was not much, but it was more than anyone else had. The breath had come before the Ven revealed many times before. They moved in cycles, sweeping through a galaxy, consuming what they could, and then retreating into the void between galaxies to digest and grow. The cycle took thousands of years, and each time the breath returned, they were larger, stronger, and hungrier. The current incursion was not an anomaly. It was the leading edge of a wave that would eventually consume the entire galaxy if it was not stopped. This revelation sent a shockwave through the conquered. The threat was not temporary. It was not something that could be waited out or negotiated away. It was existential. Admiral Reese, who had become humanity's de facto ambassador to the conquered, a role she had never wanted and could not seem to escape, addressed the gathering hall for the first time. She stood at the speaking platform, a small human figure surrounded by beings of every shape and size. And she spoke simply, the way she always spoke. "The breath are coming back," she said. "Not today, maybe not this year. But they will come, and when they do, maybe they will not care who fought at Alora Prime and who hid. They will consume everything equally. The only question is whether we face them alone or together." She looked around the vast chamber, at the Thenari perched on their high seats, at the Olsi floating in their water-filled observation pods, at the Ven sitting like ancient mountains in the back rows, at the hundreds of other species she had come to know over the past 2 years. Humanity will teach anyone who wants to learn. We will share everything we know about fighting, about defending, about war. We will not ask for payment or allegiance or submission. We will ask for one thing, that when the next call for help comes, you answer it. Not because you have to, not because someone told you to, but because it is the right thing to do. She paused. That is all I have. And that is all humanity has ever had. The willingness to show up when it matters. The response was not immediate. This was the conquered. Things moved slowly, through debate and consensus and careful deliberation. But over the following months, the coalition grew. Species that had never imagined building warships began building them, guided by human engineers. Species that had never trained soldiers began training them, guided by human marines. The shipyards of a dozen worlds retooled, and the elegant, beautiful vessels of the conquered were modified, not to replace their grace with human brutality, but to combine both. Crystal halls were reinforced with armor plating. Sensor arrays were paired with targeting computers. Ships that had been designed to explore were given the ability to fight. It was not easy. There were failures, setbacks, worry, and frustrations on all sides. Human military culture was direct, loud, and sometimes abrasive. Conquered species were patient, indirect, and sometimes maddeningly slow. Communication was a constant challenge, not just linguistic but cultural. A human drill sergeant's idea of motivation sounded like verbal abuse to most conquered species. A Thanari officer's idea of giving orders, a 30-minute mathematical proof of why a particular tactical decision was optimal, drove human soldiers to the edge of sanity. But they adapted, slowly, painfully, with 1,000 misunderstandings and 1,000 small reconciliations. They adapted, and in the process they created something that had never existed before, a military force that was not just multi-species but truly integrated, each species contributing what it did best, each one compensating for the weaknesses of the others. Human commanders provided the aggression, the tactical creativity, and the sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Thanari strategists provided the mathematical precision, the predictive models, and the logistical frameworks. Olesi navigators charted the battle space with an accuracy that bordered on precognition. Aloran soldiers, still new to warfare, still uncomfortable with violence, brought a spatial awareness and sensory acuity that made them extraordinary scouts, sensor operators, and communication specialists. A dozen other species contributed dozen other strengths. Together they were something the galaxy had never seen. Sergeant Major Vasquez, now promoted to Command Sergeant Major and assigned as senior enlisted advisor to the coalition ground forces, each spent her days training soldiers from species she had never imagined. She taught Aloran recruits how to clear a room and establish a defensive perimeter. She taught Thanari cadets, tiny, brilliant beings who came up to her, how to read a battlefield and identify threats. She taught a Ven volunteer, a being the size of a small building who moved with the speed of a glacier, how to serve as a mobile fortification, which she told Colonel Obi was the most creative use of natural ability she had ever seen in 30 years of soldiering. She was tough on them, she was tough on everyone, but she was also fair, and she cared, and the alien soldiers under her training learned to trust her the way human soldiers did. Completely. Private Wiremu, now Corporal Wiremu, became something unexpected, a cultural bridge. His gift for languages and music made him one of the few humans who could communicate naturally with Alurans, their own musical speech. He became an unofficial translator, mediator, and morale officer, moving between human and Aluran units with an easy warmth that smoothed over misunderstandings before they became problems. The Aluran soldiers adored him. They called him the human who sings, and they considered him one of their own. Captain Chen recovered from his injuries at Alora Prime, but walking with a permanent limp, was given command of the Coalition's first mixed fighter wing. Firebrand strike fighters flying alongside Aluran light craft and Alessi long-range scouts. The coordination challenges were immense. Each species' ships had different capabilities, different speeds, different communications protocols. But Chen was a pilot, and pilots spoke a universal language, the language of speed and timing and trust. Within weeks, his mixed wing was flying formation exercises that would have been impossible for any single species alone. 3 years after the Battle of Allura, Prime, the early warning network, detected what everyone had been dreading. The Vreth were coming back. The sensor data was unmistakable, a massive energy signature at the galactic rim, far larger than the force that had attacked Allura Prime. The Thenari models estimated the swarm at over 1 million ships. It was not an incursion, it was an invasion. The full weight of the Vreth Dominion, the kind of force that had consumed entire galaxies in ages past. They were heading straight for the heart of conquered space. The coalition mobilized for the first time. The gathering hall did not debate. It did not form committees or run simulations or weigh costs and benefits. It sent a single message to every world. In the conquered, they are coming, stand with us. The response was overwhelming. Ships converged from every corner of the galaxy. Human carriers and destroyers, Alloran light cruisers, Thenari sensor platforms, Olesi navigation ships, and vessels from 100 other species. They gathered at a point the Olesi strategists had identified as the optimal defensive position, a narrow corridor between two dense nebulae where the Wraith swarm would be forced to concentrate and where the Coalition's superior tactics could offset the enemy's numbers. Admiral Reese, older now grayer, with lines on her face that told the story of 3 years of relentless work, stood on the bridge of her new flagship. The old Defiance had been retired, too damaged to serve again. In its place, the Coalition had built something extraordinary, a ship that combined human engineering with conquered technology, armored and elegant, strong and beautiful. They had asked Reese to name it, and she had chosen a name that meant something. The UES answered call, the bridge crew. Around her was mixed, human officers, alongside Thenari analysts, Olesi navigators, and an Alloran communication specialist whose crystal-clear voice could be heard across every frequency. They worked together with the smooth efficiency of people who had trained together, lived together, and learned to trust each other with their lives. Outside the viewport, to the Coalition fleet stretched to the limits of visibility, thousands of ships from hundreds of species arranged in formations that would have been impossible 3 years ago. Human warships anchored the center, their heavy armor and massive weapons Clear's throat, forming the backbone of the fleet. Alluran cruisers held the flanks, their superior sensors and speed making them perfect for detecting and responding to threats. The Nari platform sat behind the battle line, processing data and feeding tactical updates to every ship. In real time, Alesi scouts ranged ahead, mapping the approaching swarm and identifying priority targets. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the galaxy's history, and it existed because 3 years ago one small species had crossed 300 light years to answer a cry for help. The Vreth arrived like a storm, and they filled the corridor between the nebulae, a wall of dark ships that blotted out the stars. The sensors counted them, and the numbers kept climbing. 1 million, 2 million, still more. It was the largest Vreth swarm ever recorded. It was the kind of force that had ended civilizations and entire galactic eras. On the bridge of the answered call, the Thenari analyst whispered a number that made everyone go still. Reese heard it, she processed it, and then she set it aside because numbers had never been what determined the outcome of a battle. She opened a channel to the fleet, every ship, every species, every soldier and sailor and pilot and engineer across thousands of vessels and hundreds of worlds. "This is Admiral Reese," she said. Her voice was calm. It was always calm. 3 years ago, a world called Elora Prime sent a signal. Into the dark, they were scared. They were alone. They were dying and they asked for help. One species answered that call. Today a galaxy answers. She looked at her bridge crew, human, Aloran Thanari, Alessi, and saw in their faces the same thing. She felt in her own chest, not just courage, not just determination. Something bigger than any of them. Something that happened when hundreds of species looked at each other and decided together that they were worth fighting. For they cried out for help. Re said, "We answered. Now we answer together." She gave the order. The coalition fleet surged forward. What followed was the largest battle the galaxy had ever seen. It raged across the corridor between the nebulae for weeks, a continuous rolling thunder of combat that involved millions of ships and billions of lives. The details of the fighting would fill libraries, but the outcome was decided not by any single moment or any single ship, but by something the Vreth collective intelligence could not compute and could not counter. The coalition fought as one, not like the Vreth's forced collective, where individual ships were extensions of a single mind, but as a true alliance. Thousands of independent minds and species choosing freely and deliberately to stand together. Human destroyers charged hive ships, while Aloran cruisers covered their flanks. The Nari analysts predicted Vreth movements minutes before they happened, feeding targeting data to human gunners who fired with devastating accuracy. Nolisi scouts guided wolf packs through gaps in the swarm that the Vreth did not know existed. Species that had been strangers 3 years ago fought back to back, covering each other, saving each other, dying for each other. On the ground, because the Vreth landed ground forces on every world they could reach. The mixed battalions fought with a ferocity and coordination that shocked even the humans. Aloran soldiers, once pacifists, stood shoulder to shoulder with human marines and fought with a fierce, quiet intensity that came from knowing exactly what they were protecting and exactly what it had cost to learn how. Corporal Wermu led a mixed platoon through a contested city, issuing orders in 3 languages and singing the Aloran battle hymn that his unit had composed together during training, a song that blended human words and Aloran melodies into something that was both and neither, something new. Command Sergeant Major Vasquez, leading a battalion of soldiers from 12 different species, held a critical mountain pass for 6 days against continuous Vreth assault. Her soldiers were exhausted, wounded, running low on ammunition. On the 5th day, a young Aloran private, one of her first trainees, took a plasma hit that should have killed him. Vasquez dragged him to cover, patched his wound with human medical supplies, and propped him against a wall. He looked at her with eyes that had shifted to gold, the Aloran color of hope. "Still here, Sergeant Major," he whispered. "Still here," she said, "SH. And we are not leaving." They held the pass all 6 days. When reinforcements finally arrived, Vasquez was still standing in the same position, still firing, still refusing to give 1 inch of ground. The turning point of the battle came on The 18th day, when the coalition fleet executed a maneuver that had been designed by Thenari strategists, refined by human tacticians, and made possible by Alessi navigation, a coordinated, simultaneous strike by over 1,000 ships on the 17 largest Vreth Hive ships. The strikes were timed to within fractions of a second, hitting the command nodes of the Vreth collective intelligence at the same moment, creating a cascade failure that disrupted the swarm's coordination across the entire battlefield. For 90 seconds, the Vreth fleet was blind. 90 seconds was enough. So the coalition poured through the gaps. Destroyer wolf packs tore into the disoriented swarm. Fighter wings swept through confused formations, destroying thousands of ships that had lost their collective direction. The human carriers advanced for the first time, their massive rail gun batteries firing in sustained salvos that carved corridors of destruction through the enemy fleet. The Vreth tried to recover. They tried to rebuild their coordination, to reform their swarms, to adapt as they had always adapted, but every time they found a new pattern, the Thenari predicted it, the Olesi mapped it, and the human-led strike forces shattered it. The coalition was not just fighting the Vreth, it was outthinking them, outmaneuvering them, beating them at their own game of adaptation. The swarm broke. It did not retreat this time. It shattered. The Vreth dominion, the ancient consumer of civilizations, the force that had crossed the void between galaxies and left nothing but dead worlds in its wake, came apart like a wave hitting a wall. Millions of ships scattered, their collective intelligence fragmenting into confusion and silence. They fled in every direction, away from the corridor, away from conquered space, away from the galaxy itself, back toward the darkness between the stars where they had come from. On the bridge of the answered call, Admiral Reese watched the tactical display clear. The red markers that had filled the screen were fading, scattering, disappearing. The blue markers, the coalition ships, held their positions, battered and bleeding but unbroken. The bridge was silent for a long time. Then the Aloran communications specialist, a young woman named Lyra, who had been one of the first Aloran cadets at the Geneva Academy, began to sing. It was a low, soft melody, an Aloran morning song for the dead, and one by one the other bridge crew joined in. The Thenari hummed in harmonic resonance, the Olsi pulsed with gentle light, and the humans, rough-voiced, off-key but entirely sincere, sang along as best they could. Reese listened. She thought about the 42,000 from the first battle and the hundreds of thousands from this one. Human, Aloran, Thenari, Olsi, and 100 other species. All of them gone. All of them here because someone had once cried out for help and someone else had answered. She leaned forward and opened a chant to the fleet. Every ship, every species, every survivor. The enemy is broken, she said. We won, not humanity, not the conquered, all of us. I together, remember this. Remember what we did here. Remember that the galaxy is full of beings who are worth fighting for, and that we proved it today. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The conquered of gentle minds was reformed. It kept its name because the gentleness was still there, still valued, still central to what the conquered believed, but it was no longer a gentleness born of avoidance. It was a gentleness backed by strength. The new conquered had a defense force, coalition fleet, and a shared commitment that no call for help would ever go unanswered again. Humanity was given a permanent seat on the Conquered Council. Admiral Reese attended the ceremony, where the old advisory label on Earth's file was formally removed. In its place, the Alorans had proposed new words that had been approved by every species in the Conquered without a single dissent. Humanity. When the galaxy was afraid, they answered. When we had no hope, they became our hope. Do not ignore them. Stand with them. Reese read the words and felt her eyes sting. She was not a woman who cried easily. She blamed the smoke on Alora Prime. The song of the answered call still sang in the wind. The memorial tower had grown over the years, new crystal nodes added for every life lost in the great battle. Not just human lives now, but Aluran and Thenari and Olsi and all the rest. The tower was taller than the original voice of Alora had ever been, and its song was richer, fuller. A melody composed of hundreds of species, blended together into something that was heartbreaking and hopeful at the same time. Elder Sarath, very old now, visited the tower every morning. She would stand at its base and listen, and sometimes she would touch the crystal and feel the warmth of life within it. And she would think about the day signal went out into the dark and someone answered. She had asked the humans once early on why they had come. Admiral Reese had given her a simple answer. Other humans had given her other answers. Duty, honor, empathy, stubbornness, the inability to hear someone suffering and do nothing about it. All of those answers were true. But Sarath, who was an artist and understood that the deepest truths were often the simplest ones, had eventually found her own answer. Humans came because that was what humans were. They were loud and messy and sometimes frightening. They fought too much and laughed too loud and felt things too deeply. They were scarred by their own history, marked by their own violence, haunted by their own mistakes. But underneath all of that, at the core of what made them human, was something that the Conquered's greatest philosophers had spent millennia searching for and never found. It was the refusal to look away. When someone was hurting, humans could not look away. When someone was in danger, humans could not stand still. When someone cried out in the dark, humans could not stay silent. It was not rational, it was not calculated, it was not always smart, but it was real, and it was powerful, and it had saved a galaxy. On the memorial hill on Alora Prime, the wind blew through the crystal tower, and 42,000 voices sang alongside hundreds of thousands more, a chorus of the honored dead whose sacrifice had proven something that the universe had always needed to know, that the darkness was vast and cold and full of terrible things, but it was not empty, because somewhere out there, always there were humans, and humans answered always.